It's basically the same thing.
Hi everyone. Welcome. Welcome today. It's so nice to see so many nice familiar faces, especially after I haven't seen so many of you together for a long time. So it's my honor today to introduce Professor Jaklin Kornfilt, who is a professor in Syracuse University, as our next speaker in the Sinor lecture series. Professor Kornfilt, as you know, is one of the most well-known Turkish and Turkic linguists ever. In fact, her reputation goes well beyond Turkish and Turkic languages. Her contributions have shaped the entire field of linguistics, especially the fields of syntax and morphology. As you know, this talk is part of the Sinor lecture series. This series was endowed by Jean and Dennis Sinor. Dennis Sinor, as you know, was a pioneer in Central Eurasian Studies and a founder of our department, the Department of Central Eurasian Studies. Sinor lecturers are leading figures in their fields, focusing on the histories, religions, languages, cultures, and societies of this vast geographic area. And today, the focus is on Turkey, or the Turkish language, which is right in the center, at the center of Central Eurasia by several measures. Professor Jaklin Kornfilt has a PhD in linguistics from Harvard University and specializes in syntax morphology interface, the syntactic theory, and of course with a special emphasis on Turkish and Turkic languages. Although she also has worked on other languages of the world as well. She has countless highly cited articles and books on Turkish and Turkic linguistics. Perhaps most notable among them is her detailed and theoretically informed descriptive reference grammar on the Turkish language, which to date has been the primary to-go resource for any linguist doing any kind of work on Turkish. In fact, thanks in part to her groundbreaking work, many leading linguists and typologists have paid more attention to Turkish instead of focusing only on European languages when it comes to work in linguistics, theoretical work in linguistics. And I should also add that my own training in linguistics has benefited a lot from her work. I have been trained in linguistics by reading her articles, her books, all the way since my undergraduate times in Turkey, including my master's, PhD times in North America. So we have a really valuable guest today. And I should also add that I have several copies of her Turkish book, because it's always handy whenever you do any kind of research on Turkish. So it's a true honor today to be hosting Professor Kornfilt, who will be presenting on linguistic change based on borrowings with a focus on Turkish. Her talk is titled, "How Abstract Can Borrowings Be in Linguistic Change?" So please join me in welcoming Professor Kornfilt.
Thank you, Renat, for this very nice introduction and for your generosity in inviting me to give this lecture. And thank you all for making the time to come. I want to, in this talk, which I'll try to keep rather short so that we can have a discussion. I want to present a few examples, which I would tentatively actually like to present to you as instances of borrowing, of syntactic borrowing, but I don't think that those examples have ever been described or introduced under that title. So you might want to challenge that idea. And so this is why I think it would be good to have a discussion. Maybe it's all wrong, but nonetheless, it might be new and might give you some ideas for further research. And Indiana, I think, would be a very good place for research of that kind, given that not only do you have great linguistics on this campus, you also have Turkic languages and neighboring languages to the Turkic area, which makes it important, of course, for any idea, tentative or not, to look for as you look for answers for certain generalizations that you might notice. So to start with, yeah, I actually need something also in front of me. Just 1 second. To synchronize with what you can see. So we can start with obvious examples of borrowings, which are not contested because they are so clear. And those, of course, are in the lexicon. And this is the area in the language that everybody thinks of first when you think of borrowing and influences of borrowing for any kind of language change. So from the point of view of Turkish then, the older sources of such borrowings are Arabic and Persian, and I'm sure that to this audience, this is nothing new. Arabic, you find the older borrowings together with their Arabic plural forms. So the lexical item comes with functional inflection, also from the donor language, so to speak. So kitab, book, obviously, but the first instances of borrowing also bring their own Arabic plural forms like kutub, books. And some of those still survive in very frozen situations. So for example, library is kutuphane. So the combination of the Arabic plural with the Persian word for place, space, and so on. On the other hand, though, in part due to nationalistic pressure, even while the word survives as a borrowing, it now has Turkish inflection in the plural, so kitaplarna. Same thing with country, so memleket and memalik, the Arabic plural, but now even where you still do use memleket, which you don't always do, because now, of course, again, due to language reform and otherwise other kinds of pressures, we have ülke, but nonetheless, you still have memleket and you can pluralize it the Turkish way. And now, though, what I wanted to focus more on are more recent borrowings and borrowings from West European languages. And here I cite Johansson, who is a Turkologist, whom I'm sure many of you know about, in his description of Turkish and Turkic in an anthology published in 1998, says that the influence of Western European vocabulary has become very important in the modern period. As far as Turkish is concerned, adoption of Italian, French, and other Western loanwords begin in Ottoman. So the Ottoman part is the important bit here, because he wants to say, and probably against very recent nationalistic critics, that, calm down, this is not something horrible that is happening right now due to Western colonialization or something like that, because Western influence is actually older, is what he's saying here. And and this happened not only during our times, the time of the Turkish Republic, but predates this. And so let's start looking at some of those in today's Turkish. And certainly a lot of culinary terms come from Greek and Italian, given that, in fact, we have both cultures as part of the Ottoman Empire. So starting with Italian, of course, you do find some slight semantic distinctions between the Turkish usage and what we have in the donor language, but by and large, it's the same. So makarna, for example, means noodles in Turkish. Macaroni in Italian is a particular kind of noodle, while in Turkish it's more general than that, but it's the influence is clear and it survives. And as far as I know, there is no other word for it in today's Turkish. Or pasta, which in Turkish is cake or pastry, and in fact not noodles. But again, it's your basic carbs, so to speak. Or lokanta, which comes from lokanda. And other than culinary terms too, so bilye, for example, the marble in the game, or bilardo from Italian. Greek is, of course, a very big source of culinary terms, especially anything having to do with fish and seafood and seafaring life and so on, which, of course, is not at all surprising, given that these people came ultimately from Central Asia and had nothing much to do with the sea. And so all of these terms survive. And in fact, even if there had been pressure to do away with them, what would they have been replaced with? So there was nothing else. While with a lot of other vocabulary, of course, you could either make up things based on Turkic patterns in other Turkic languages, or you could make up things with the resources of Turkish itself. But of course, for all these different fish, there is nothing else that you can come up with, so you let them be. And then, in fact, starting with the Ottoman era, you find French vocabulary, like restaurant, which comes from restaurant, obviously, bureau, from bureau, vapur, which means steamship in Turkish, from vapeur, which is not ship, of course, but which is steam, and tren, a fish, and so on. Then, of course, more recently, you have English influence, obviously. So you have poster now. And in fact, you can even see certain changes, certain tendencies in this borrowed vocabulary that mirrors the importance of French vis-a-vis English or vice versa, given that the latter, of course, has become more important and more prevalent. So many people today, in fact, don't use bureau anymore, and they use office, or instead of affiche, you use poster, of course, with the Turkish stress. And then there are certain patterns where borrowed vocabulary is put together in a Turkish way, but vocabulary which itself is not Turkish. And there are very, very nice, I find, combinations such as pastahane, for example, which I might be wrong, but as far as I know, does not exist in Persian as such, right? So pasta, as I said, so pastry, cake, and hane, Persian, so pasta hane is can be a tea room, but in any event is a place where pastries are baked. And posta hane is, of course, a post office. So these are very obvious kinds of examples of borrowing, changing in almost a trivial way the lexicon of the language. But then, maybe more interestingly, there are, and in fact, there's postane and pastane, there is the story of compounds. So here we come into the realm of patterns, where not only lexical items are borrowed, but patterns are borrowed. So in addition, of course, to the Turkic pattern of compounds, where we have the head, so for the non-linguist, the most important part of the compound coming last. And for anything that's not the head, coming before the head. So that's the Turkic pattern, and that we have still even in the Ottoman times, where Ottoman Turkish had become so un-Turkic, but nonetheless, these compounds were around. But then with the borrowed lexical items, one had a Persian pattern of compounds, namely where the head is first rather than last, and where the non-head comes later, and where between the two there is a linker, for lack of another term. So E. And so reis Cumhur, President of the Republic. So president is the head of the compound. Cumhur is the non-head, so the head of whatever it happens to be, in this instance, the Republic. So reis Cumhur is the president of the Republic. So again, under the pressure of the language reform, this pattern became a red flag at some point. And so then, while keeping the lexical items, why those were not red flagged, I'm not quite sure, and some of you might give an answer to that. But the pattern became Turkish or Turkic, so that instead of reis Cumhur, we have Cumhur reisi. You might wonder about the E there. The E is a nominal compound marker in Turkish, at the same time a third person singular possessivity marker. So it's actually a coincidence that the linker, that the Persian linker and that the Turkish compound marker happen to be the same under certain phonological conditions. So the E in Turkish is not a linker in that sense. But anyway, you see that the lexical items are the same. So you have reis, the head, and Cumhur, the Republic. But the order is reversed, so that's the Turkish order. So Cumhur reisi, meaning the same thing. And then later, once you have that, you also give in to the nationalistic pressure and replace at least one of the lexical items with something that's really Turkish, namely başkan, which baş is head, so the head, the chair, the leader. And so now we have both a Turkish pattern and with at least 50% or maybe 60% of the Turkish vocabulary as well. Had there been no pressure to undo reisi Cumhur, maybe Cumhurbaşkanı would never have happened. And we would continue with something like reisi Cumhur, which then would have meant that we still would have had a Persian pattern, not only Persian vocabulary, but Persian pattern alive and well. And we still do have the pattern, but it's very limited with certain frozen compounds. But as you see, language change based on borrowing is not at all limited to the vocabulary, even though that's the most concrete, most transparent, most immediately striking area of the language. And so this I'm taking then as a bridge to slowly going towards a direction of trying to find more abstract patterns of borrowing. So we come to syntax now. So we started with the lexicon, went to the morphology, and now we come to syntax. And again, Johansson observes, and here I quote him, there are even tendencies to use conditionals and optatives in the sense of Indo-European subjunctive. Why does he say even? So as those of you who know Turkish or Turkey know, the typical embedding in those languages is of a type which is, say, like the English gerundive. So an embedded clause, a subordinate clause, looks quite different from a simple clause or from a main clause in a complex construction. And so these subordinate clauses are not tensed. And just like the English gerundive, like going, reading, and so on, they are more or less tense neutral, let's say. They take on the tense of whatever the main clause has as a tense. Although there are some distinctions depending on the kind of gerundive. So beyond the ing, English gerundives don't have much else to offer, but Turkish has two main types and a third type as well, which is a bit less prevalent. So, and in fact, the two types have certain mood connotations, and they are a bit in parallel with what you find in certain, especially Romance languages. So those of you who know French or maybe Spanish and so on are familiar with mood distinctions between indicatives and subjunctives. So indicatives are things that happen or have happened and so on, while subjunctives are things that might happen or should happen, that ought to happen, and so on. And so these nominalized gerundive-like patterns seem to have taken on the function of these mood distinctions in West European languages in a way in which cognate languages, cognate Turkic languages, have not done. And so this is why Johansson, in my interpretation, says even here. So let's first look at a couple of examples and then we'll go beyond those. So just to illustrate the subjunctive in French. So the first example here, number one, je veux qu'elle vienne. So que is what we call in linguistics the complementizer, the introducer of the subordinate clause, elle, she, and vienne. So it's not vient, but vienne, which is the subjunctive form. So I want that she should come. I don't know that she will come, but that's my wish. Vienne then is a subjunctive. And now looking at this gerundive-like, one of the gerundive-like patterns In Turkish, in example number 2, I bold-faced the marker on the nominalized verb of the subordinate clause. So me or ma, depending on vowel harmony, which here I glossed as a subjunctive nominalizer. So I want for Oya to come. I don't know that she will come. I don't know if she will even be able to come, but that's my wish. And so that's the one nominalizer. We will see another one, which is more like the indicative mood in languages like French. As I say here in the PDF, that seems to be an innovation, that kind of distinction between subordinate clauses with the nominalized pattern. And then, so you might then wonder, where does this come from? If other cognate languages don't make that distinction, and if the common language, we don't actually have a documented Turkic, Proto-Turkic language, of course, one can try to reconstruct something or other. But if there was no such a distinction, why should Turkish have introduced such a distinction? While it does that in its own means, as you see. So the suffix and other suffixes are not borrowed. These are around, were around, can be found in certain other cognate languages. So whatever is happening within the Turkish or Turkic morphosyntax. But nonetheless, there is some notion of trying to express mood distinctions via the means of the language's own syntax and morphology. And so when you try to answer that question, where does this come from? Johansson might be right that this might be an influence of West European languages, with which, of course, Turkish has been in contact, as we just said, starting from the later times of the Ottoman Empire through, of course, the Turkish Republic to our days now. What Johansson actually might have really meant, without going into these nominalized Turkic patterns, might have been yet another pattern where the embedded clause is actually not nominalized, not even nominalized. And that might be another source for him to say even. Because there is a pattern which is more restricted than this gerund-like pattern, where the embedded clause is in fact even more like subordinate clauses in West Indo-European languages, and where the subordinate clause is like a main clause without being nominalized, not like a gerundive, and having certain verb forms that you find in main clauses, in simple clauses as well. And this is illustrated in 3. So I want for Oya to come, but the sin, the bold-faced sin suffix here is called by traditional grammarians the optative. And it is something like the subjunctive in the Romance languages. And in Western European languages. And you can find it not only in subordinate clauses, but also in main clauses as well. And we will, I think later in this PDF, we will see 1 or 2 examples of that nature. So in addition now, so it looks like, in addition to having introduced a distinction between different moods, like indicative versus subjunctive, Turkish has also introduced and is slowly widening in a pattern of non-nominalized subordinate clauses, of clauses which are of the same shape as any main clause. And again, you then wonder, where does that come from? Notice, though, that this is not a full-fledged copy of what we find in these West Indo-European languages, because, in fact, the syntax is still Turkish or Turkic, because, as you see here, you have the embedded clause, but the main verb comes after the embedded clause. In French, of course, it would be the other way around. Je veux, so I want. Qu'elle vienne would be after the main verb. But here, the embedded clause with the subjunctive or optative precedes the main verb. And that's, of course, a Turkic pattern with the verb being at the end. So that's the main verb being at the end of the main clause, with the embedded clause preceding it, the embedded clause being the object of the main clause. So again, you might say, okay, there is some borrowing, but not a full-fledged copy of West Indo-European patterns, because otherwise it is a bit difficult to explain where these come from. And again, as you see, there is not one vocabulary item that's borrowed here. What's borrowed here is a notion of a certain distinction and the notion of finiteness, if you will, or of tensiveness, of subordinate clauses being like main clauses with respect to their verbs and all the inflection that comes with them. So if these are examples of borrowings, these are borrowings of certainly much more abstract way than what we saw in the borrowings of the vocabulary. Nonetheless, they are apparently changing some of the syntax of the language. Now, there is or were certain instances of syntactic copies which are more obvious than what we see here. And that lead one to think more of the borrowings in the lexicon, in the vocabulary. So to contrast what we just saw, there is also the borrowing of a Persian, so also Indo-European pattern, but not of a Western one, but of a rather Eastern one, namely the pattern that Persian, of course, has, but that also West European languages have, namely of a subordinate clause following the main verb and being introduced by a complementizer, which itself, of course, is also cognate with certain complementizers in the Western Indo-European languages, like the French que. So we have in Persian ki, which has certainly a very similar shape and the same identical function, really. So before we come to that, I had wanted to show you the more general Turkish pattern in a little bit more detail. So the nominalized subordinate pattern. So that's something like, I heard about John's coming to town. So English has these kinds of gerundives too. So a nominalized embedding that does not look like a main clause. But of course, in English, these are more limited, right? That's not the most typical way to subordinate clauses. These, of course, again, in Turkish, precede the main verb. So in 5, I heard that John will be coming to our city. You see the future. I should have actually glossed this as a future nominalizer because this is not the same future as the future in a main clause. So you can make certain tense distinctions in these sort of reduced nominalized embedded clauses, but not with the subjunctive ones, but rather with the indicative nominalized ones. And so this is a future indicative nominalized type, which we can then see with some of the later examples. So again, let's continue comparing this with English. So in 6, gives you a sense of the Turkish pattern with the embedded gerundive preceding the main verb. So it's like something like John's to our city coming. Heard I, or I heard. So as you see, the gerundive clause precedes the main verb, and everything in the embedded verb itself also precedes the verb of the embedded clause. So very strictly a verb final, and the coming is then the gerund-like verb of the embedded clause. In English, as I was saying, this is not typical. 7 would be the more typical pattern. I heard that John came to town, or that John will come to town, and so on. So Ottoman did borrow such a pattern from Persian, and this we see in 8. Duydum ki John şehrimize gelecek. So here we have, you can see sort of almost morpheme by morpheme, the Persian, Indo-European more generally, pattern. So I heard, and then, so the main verb first, and then the subordinate clause, and that's obligatory, and you have no other choice. So the embedded clause must come after the verb in this Persian pattern. And so then we have the complementizer, the cognator, and then, but the embedded clause itself is still Turkish, you notice. So the verb is lost in the clause, but you see the embedded verb is tense, it's not nominalized, and the clause itself follows the complementizer. That's also just like in Indo-European, and the entire embedded clause with the complementizer follows the main verb. That's also like in Indo-European, and you have no other choices, and those things are fixed. And just to show you that this is not just made up stuff, here are some examples from secondary literature. I did not go to primary sources for those, but so here you have an example from an article by Celia Karslake, who was a British specialist in Ottoman. And so this is something from, she says, early Ottoman Turkish, which would be probably not later than the 16th century or so. Early Ottoman, right? If not earlier. So you know that your comrades will not be your friends, will not come to your aid, and so on. And so again, the embedded verb is not nominalized, it's tense. It's just like a main clause, it looks like a main clause. It's introduced by this complementizer, by this Indo-European complementizer. The complementizer precedes, just like in Indo-European. And the whole combination of complementizer and tense verb follows the main verb. So the pattern is just like typical Indo-European, no wonder, of course, coming from Persian. So even though in the language reform of the Republic, there was a lot of pressure to get rid of this pattern, and in fact, it is not used very widely, but in certain circumstances and in certain styles, you certainly still find it. And we will come back to that. Okay, so, but that was one kind of case study that I wanted to show you of an actual syntactic borrowing, and also of some borrowing which is not tentative, which is more tentative, like this distinction between moods, between indicative and subjunctive, which was not there up until it was introduced in Turkish, but not in other languages that were not in such close contact with Western Indo-European languages. And also what I showed you of subordinate final clauses, tense clauses, but without a complementizer and preceding the verb. So that was less of a copy than what we saw here from Persian. So that's almost a word by word, morpheme by morpheme copy with the same structure, the same order, and so on. What I showed you before, without a complementizer and with the finite clause preceding the main verb, that's also an innovation, but more in the means of Turkish itself. We will come back to that. So one case study, then different moods, different word order, difference and introduction of non-nominalized, non-reduced kinds of subordinate clauses, which one I would like to say are more abstract types of borrowings. Not so much like here, and certainly not in the vocabulary where you can recognize the borrowing immediately. Let's look at another case study of the more abstract kind. Let's now look at infinitival clauses. So subordinate clauses whose verb has infinitival morphology. Of course, English has lost that morphology, but at least it has two as the marker of the infinitive. So in example 10, I hope to leave early. So the two marks the embedded clause as an infinitival clause, of course. And I gave you here a representation to reflect the way we interpret such examples, namely that the subject of this infinitival clause is understood as, in this instance, the subject of the main clause, right? The person who is to leave early is I, and the person who has a hope is also I. If instead of having some silent subject, which you have to interpret as co-referring, as referring back to something in the main clause, if instead you have an audible subject, the result is bad in English. So you cannot say, I hope I to leave early. You also, of course, cannot say, I hope she to leave early, nor even I hope her to leave early, even though if I said these things, you would understand what I was trying to say. So there is nothing wrong really with the meaning of these ill-formed examples. So on the other hand, while in many other in European languages, that would be the end of the story, and you would just have to say, with infinitival clauses, you need to have a silent subject that you interpret by virtue of another noun phrase in the main clause. English has a way to get around this, and by using a complementizer, a particular one, not any complementizer, but for, which of course is like a homonym of the preposition for. And then it's okay. So you can say, I hope for her to leave early. Maybe it sounds stupid, but not ill-formed. Based on examples like this, but of course also other examples in other areas, a principle was proposed by Chomsky and some other syntacticians, saying that audible noun phrases need to have case. I'm not sure whether everybody in the room is familiar with the notion of case. So if you have studied a language like Latin, let's say, or Slavic languages or certain Germanic languages, you will have encountered that notion. But English, which had it, which by and large has lost it, still has it in its pronouns. So if you have a pronoun like I, like here, I hope, the I has a subject form, let's say, a subject case form. But if that same pronoun with the same features has the function not of a subject, but of an object, a direct object, let's say, it needs to change its shape, right? So you cannot say you saw I last night at the opera. You have to say you saw me last night at the opera. So the difference between I and me would give you a handle on this notion of case. I would be in the subject case form, while me would be in the object case form. And the sources of these cases, you can think of being in the instance of the object case, the verb, because the object complements the verb. So the verb assigns this object case to the object. While for the subject, what has been proposed is that it is the tense and or subject agreement element that assigns or allows the subject case on the subject. Now, in an infinitival clause, there is no tense. And in Turkish, you can see very clearly that there is no agreement, no subject agreement on the verb either. So there is no source within an infinitival clause for a subject case to be given to the subject. So if the idea of this proposal that all audible noun phrases need case to be okay, if that's on the right track, then we can understand why examples like 11 are ill-formed. Because then I or she or her, thank you, here remain without a case because 2 is not a tense marker. And so it's unable to assign case to these audible subject noun phrases. And that leads to the ill-formedness, which is marked by this little asterisk there. That leads to number 11 to be ill-formed. Now, in 12, in the way English gets around that is that this complementizer has the ability, just like a preposition, to assign case to its own object. And so I won't bore you then with the syntactic tricks in which you can sort of make the subject of the infinitival clause something like an object of for. But by doing that, you manage for to assign case to her. While in 11, there is nothing like that to be able to assign case to I or she or her. And so that minimal pair, if you want, then establishes the validity of the idea of what's often called the case filter in syntactic theory, namely a device, a principle that filters out occurrences that have noun phrases without a case. Now, this seems to be not a universal, the case filter, at least not for subjects, and at least not in this form. And so when you look at Ottoman Turkish, and 13 is one such example. And I bold-faced here the infinitive of the subordinate clause. Mak is the infinitival suffix on B, and you is the subject of the subordinate clause. There is no tense, just like in the English infinitival clauses. There is no agreement inflection. So there is nothing to assign case to the subject. You might say that, well, even for such a language, the case filter is valid, but there are other ways to assign case to the subject. Certainly, however, not a tense or agreement on the verb, because there is nothing like that in this kind of example. So apparently, this kind of pattern was quite productive in Ottoman. This example is also taken from secondary literature. I got that from the very popular Turkish grammar by Jeffrey Lewis. And so he himself cites this from a source of Anatolian Ottoman of the 16th century. Then we have example 14. So this too is taken from Celia Karslake, who says that it's taken from a text of the 18th century. So here we're getting into quite recent times. And here too, still, when we have an infinitival clause, again, without a tense and without any agreement, we have two bold-faced subjects here. So the Grand Admiral and reinforcements subjects, and they are okay, even under the absence of any agreement and any tense. You cannot do that in today's Turkish any longer. So now, instead, you either, just like in English or other West European languages, when you have any infinitival embedded clause, either the subject has to be silent and referring back to something in the main clause, or it cannot be an infinitival and you have to change the verb of the subordinate clause into something. It can be nominalized, in fact, a subjunctive nominalization again, which does take agreement morphology with the subject. And then it's okay. Only the case then on the subject case is different. It becomes a genitive case, and then it's okay. So you don't find that change of assigning the subject case by tense and/or agreement to the subject that now Turkish has in a very strict way. You don't find that in many cognate Turkic languages, as far as I know. And in those languages, you still can find patterns of that nature, right? That then means that the idea either of the case filter and or the way subject case is assigned by certain elements on the predicate, on the verb of the embedded clause, have changed in the syntax of today's Turkish. And they seem to have become, in fact, like Western Indo-European languages in that respect, in that when you have an infinitival clause, you cannot have an audible subject unless you somehow change the verb from being an infinitive to something else that can assign subject case to the subject. So that too, then, I would like to propose tentatively at this point, is the influence of contact with West Indo-European languages, namely part of their syntactic structure without actually copying or borrowing morphology and vocabulary. So far, so good, or do you have any questions? We can stop for a couple of minutes, and if you have any comments or, yes, Steve?
All the example that you just scrolled under, the other elements of the clause are in front of the subject. Is that weird, or is that just this example?
Yeah, so that's an adjunct.
Right, but if it was a finite clause in modern Turkish, couldn't be subject to.
It's not the clause, it's part of the clause, it's not itself a clause, it's an adjunct within this, yeah, right, so.
But the order of those with respect to the subject, is that unusual or is that normal?
Well, it was and still is a rather free word order language. So I imagine that this adjunct could also follow the subjects. Certainly in modern Turkish, such adjuncts can. Yes.
Yeah, I had a question about the first syntactic point you mentioned between the indicative and non-indicative modes and where it comes from. Do you think, so if I understood you correctly, you think that this is a Western Indo-European influence and not from Persian? Because for me, it seems like this could be also from Persian. You had the one sentence where you say, what was it, elle veut qu'elle vienne or something? And where in French you have the subjunctive then in the subordinate clause. You have that in Persian too, and you have some Turkic languages under the influence of Persian where this distinction also arises, like in the Turkmen and Uzbek dialects of Afghanistan.
So it could be that in these languages, in fact, Persian played the role that French might have played for Turkish. So it seems that certainly for the embedded nominalized clauses, the change so that you have both man and dik yajak. So the nominalized subjunctive versus the nominalized indicative is a later change. So post-dating, the other influences that Persian did have, obviously, on Ottoman Turkish. So, for example, this seems to come after the copied pattern with introduced by Key. Okay. Yes.
So I've worked with a lot of the comparative syntax of head final languages, strictly head final languages like Turkish, Mongolian, Tibetan, Japanese, for example. particularly in relation to clause ordering, because of course a head final language has a very strict clause ordering where you have to have subordinate clauses coming first, as we've seen here with the complementized clauses. And I've noticed that in comparison to the other Turkic languages, of course, Turkish stands out having loaned in this key complementizer, as well as the çünkü because complementizer, which is an element that no other Turkic language has. And so whereas I would classify the Turkic languages and many of their neighbors to the east as belonging to kind of a typological group of being strictly head final, it seems to me that these loans not only loan in a structure to Turkish, but also change its typological alignment entirely. Do you think that's a reasonable level of loaning as well, or?
Possibly. It would certainly be worth checking out. Yes. And there are also changes in other branches of Turkic in Europe itself. So, for example, Balkan Turkish or Turkic, whatever you want to call it, in general. So they too, they have complementizer-like usages of certain vocabulary items, right? And tensed embedded clauses rather than nominalized embedded clauses, and possibly, and again, one should look at more than one such Balkan language. They seem to have WH elements that move to the left instead of being in situ, as in Turkish and most other Turkic languages.
Thank you.
Yes, yeah, especially the WH movement. It is interesting in Balkan Turkish. So I don't think anybody has said anything about that yet. But if you look, I tried to look at some samples of texts, and that does seem to be the case. But I didn't, put that into the PDF this time because that's really, from the point of view of data, for me, too tentative. I would like to see more of that. Okay, and then one more pattern. It's a bit later than I thought it was. Let's look at relative clauses. One difference between relative clauses in Turkish and at least some varieties of Azeri and Azerbaijani is a difference in the verbal morphology of the embedded clause. In relative clauses that I'll try to explain it to you in a moment, that target subjects versus other elements in the clause. So you have different verbal forms on the subordinate clause in a relative clause depending on what the relative clause means. The head of the relative clause, what it corresponds to in the embedded clause. If it corresponds to the subject, the verb has a particular participle form. If it corresponds to anything other than the subject, it has a very general kind of nominalized form that's not even limited to relative clauses that you find in indicative subordinate clauses in general. And this pattern you don't find in other Turkic languages at all. So to show you, is he going to come back? Who is going to
He
scroll?
will be back. For now, I can do it.
Yeah?
Yep.
Oh, okay, great, thank you. So let's look at 15 then. So the people who saw me on the island last summer. So that is a relative clause that targets a subject, right? The people who saw me, the seers of me. And so that's the subject, and that corresponds to the people. So here then, this bold-faced en is the special form, that you don't find elsewhere and that you find in this context. So this is just the citation form of that morpheme. Now, when you look at other examples, both past forms and cognate current forms of languages, you can try to find minimal pairs of subject versus non-subject relative clauses, and you're going to find that there is no such distinction as modern Turkish, and as I said, certain varieties of modern Azerbaijani and Azeri make. So, again, citing from secondary sources, this is, I think, from Jaklin, and it's a non-subject relative clause. And interestingly, you see here a participle form, which is a cognate of the special Turkish form, and yet it does not have that function. It has the function of a general participle. So here the relative clause is a non-subject relative clause, and yet you have this morpheme. So what we are looking here is really syntax, syntactic structure, and not morphemes. So the two, while syntax uses certain morphemes, it's not dependent on these morphemes. So the morphemes have their own life, so to speak. Now, looking at some contemporary Turkic languages, let's look at Saha, Ken's prohibit, to examples 17 and 18. So Saha is, as these people call themselves, the Russians and the others have been calling them Yakut, same thing with the language. So it's a language spoken, yeah, if we have time, we can look at the map, spoken in the northeast in Siberia. 17 illustrates a subject relative clause, the dog which should drink the milk, and 18 illustrates a non-subject relative clause, the milk the dog should drink. And you notice the bold-faced verbal forms are exactly the same. So this would not happen in modern Turkish, of course. And now I have a pair in Uyghur, one example of which I owe to my and your colleague, Philip Lesueur, who very generously shared the results of his field work, shall we say, field methods course at Harvard many years ago on Uyghur. And so your sister who lives in Ürümqi, that's a subject relative clause, and 20, a non-subject relative clause, the person whom you look for or whom you will look for has moved away. And that I owe to Abdul Rashid Yaqub, who is a native speaker and a Turkologist. And so here too, so a subject and a non-subject relative clause, the verbal forms are the same. And again, that would not happen in modern Turkish. So I had shown you in Turkish what the subject relative clause looks like with this special participle form. In 21, you see an example of a non-subject relative clause in modern Turkish. So here, it is a totally unrelated form to the special participle. No phonological or morphological bridge can be formed between the two. And what we find there is the same form, as I told you just a few minutes ago, that we find in any kind of embedded indicative subordinate clause. Where does this pattern come from? So for non-subject relative clauses, something very general, embedding in general of the nominalized form, but for subject relative clauses, something different altogether. Now let's look. And yes, to show you, let's look at 22 in modern Turkish. So this is not a relative clause. Here we just have an embedded nominalized indicative clause. I heard that the students saw me on the island. Nothing is targeted, no relative clause. And you see, again, bold-faced, the same verbal morphology that we saw in non-subject relative clauses. Now, of all languages, just in French, we have, by and large, a similar pattern. Although the embedded clauses, of course, are not nominalized, they are pure regular finite tense clauses. So in 23, we have an embedded indicative clause, tense. Je sais que le pilote est mort. I know that the pilot is dead, or driver is dead. Now, a non-subject general clause shows the same pattern. So the car which the pilot or the driver drove. And so you have, again, the general complementizer in both. But when you look at 25, where you have a subject relative clause, le pilote qui a conduit l'auto, the driver who has driven the car, that's okay. But if you use the general complementizer, that's no good. So you cannot say le pilote que a conduit l'auto. So you have the same distribution as in modern Turkish. So the non-subject relative clause has the pattern of a general embedded indicative. The subject relative clause has a special shape. And again, when you look at Turkic, other than Azerbaijani, which is so similar to Turkish in many respects, and certain varieties, not all, have that pattern too, but no other Turkic language. And so then you wonder, again, where this comes from, something so special. There aren't many languages that have this kind of pattern of having a subject relative clause have such a special shape that it does not share with others, while non-subject relative clauses do. So as now the last bit is going back to the non-nominalized embedded clauses in modern Turkish. So on page 7, we have a repetition of what we saw before. Example 3, I want Oya to come with the optative, not nominalized, but before the main verb. The embedded clause is the expected pattern before the verb of the main clause, but it's not nominalized. So from the point of view of the embedding itself, it's not Turkic. From the point of view of its position in the main clause, it is Turkic. And here you have now an example that you did not see before, namely just to see that this kind of embedding has the exact same shape as it could have as a main clause. So that is not typical among the Turkic languages. So then, if we go one more, we come to our very last example on this PDF, 3C. And now we see that we can also have this kind of embedding, non-nominalized, also after the main verb. And that now is the last bit, because this pattern, now we see a non-originally Turkic pattern, not only within the embedded clause, but also within the higher clause, with the embedded clause, not where we would expect it, but after the verb. Yes, John?
Would that be considered backgrounding in some instances?
Maybe, yes, maybe, because you can do that with, as I said, Turkish, as most other Turkic languages, is very word order free. You can get, certainly in main clauses, you can get post-verbal elements that you might characterize as backgrounded. Even if so, and of course, that would be good to check to see whether these post-verbal but finite tense clauses, whether they are similar in their syntactic properties to post-verbal nominalized clauses. And also whether they are similar to examples with key, which of course predate this development. So the key type that we talked about, borrowed from Persian, of course, was around during Ottoman times, tons of them. This is a new development, and it is getting more and more productive. You hear it certainly colloquially a lot, right? Then one question might be, well, could we analyze that just like a further development, a step after the key pattern? Just take out the key and then this is what you get. Is that what's happening? Or is it rather a further step in the development from the nominalized embedded clause to the left of the verb, like in the key, from there to non-nominalized but fully finite clauses still to the left of the verb? So the embedded clause in the European, let's say, but the position, Turkey, and then you might say perhaps backgrounded to post-verbal position. Is this what this represents? Or does this represent something that was there already to the right of the verb? Just take out the complementizer. These would give you two very different syntactic structures. I think I'm not absolutely sure yet, but I think that it is actually backgrounding. It is not the Persian structure with the complementizer erased. And that you can see by certain syntactic properties that I won't bore you with, but for the syntacticians, so there are binding differences. So these, I think, are higher in the structure than the Persian embedded clause, which is lower in the structure. So it have different C command relationships to what's before the verb. But as I said, this is tentative, but I wanted to bring it up, especially to you as an audience in a place like Indiana, where there are so many different languages, especially from the point of view of borrowing, where you should be looking into. So just as a essentially one sentence summary, there is more to borrowing than meets the eye. And so if you look, you can find a lot of surprising and challenging things.
I think it's
Any other questions?
well, I've been thinking about how one can go about trying to prove the influence of French on Turkish.
Well,
I mean, I'm thinking in terms of looking at early 20th century literature, like by authors who have studied in French schools, like Yakub Kadri Karaosmanoglu, and then comparing that to other Turkish authors, and I'm wondering if anyone has tried doing that.
I don't think so, but that might be one possible source. Of course, Karalis Mamoglu is not the only source, but especially in early Republican Turkish, it was very, very popular to translate all these French, novels into Turkish. They were published right and left, and even serialized in newspapers and so on. So that might be one source of influence, but there was also more. There was commerce, there was education. So many intellectuals were sent to France, to Paris in particular, for their higher education. For the higher bourgeoisie, or not even so high bourgeoisie in Istanbul, starting from the Ottomans, not only during the Republican days, the better families had French governments for their children. I had myself some classmates in primary school whose French was almost better than their Turkish. So there were various sources of influence, certainly not a single one. And also, I should mention actually that this pattern that we saw with French is not limited to French among the Indo-European languages. So there are at least two that I know about and have seen examples for, namely Bavarian in German and some other southern dialects of German, similar pattern. So the general embedding pattern seen in non-subject relative clauses and subject relative clauses looking different. So southern dialects of German, and then the famous West Flemish examples, which I don't know much about, but have been reported by syntacticians such as Liliane Hagemann, for example.
So how would you characterize, say, like the current state or rate of borrowing of other structures into Turkish, given like the current political climate for example, like you mentioned that this key construction has now been somewhat relegated to very specific constructions.
The C construction, you meant the very last example?
No, the CP where you had that key that was borrowed, that key.
Yeah. The Persian.
Correct, yeah. So are borrowings like that becoming more common, less common? I mean, especially with the comments that have been made about, potential Turkic transition towards more left-headed or, headedness ambiguous language. Is that something that might continue, or has the climate intervened such that might be as far as it gets?
So until recently, I think that the limitation had to do with official language, written official language, where you could find lots of this. Legalese also, for example, government decrees and so on. But there are certain circumstances where you could and still can find them even colloquially. And it would be interesting, and I don't know, but it would be interesting to actually look into this and see whether those appear with certain verbs and not others, certain main clause verbs and not others. So things like, and now you see that I had always claimed such and such, and now you see key that this and that is indeed true. Something like that. So there you could find it colloquially as well. I'm not sure about how productive it is when you look at the entire corpus of verbs. And it might be interesting, in fact, if anybody is interested in corpus studies, that might be an interesting place to do it.
Since we are running a little bit late, maybe one final question. Okay. So thank you so much.